Well, welcome. Welcome to today's presentation of animal cruelty, the link to human violence and impact on families. We are very excited that you're here for this Safe Passage for Children of Minnesota presentation today with our special guest. Our mission at Safe Passage is to ensure that Minnesota has a child welfare system in which children are safe and reach their full potential. And so I welcome you to our website as well to check out more information about us and how to get involved as a supporter or a volunteer with the many opportunities that we have available. My name is Aviva Lear, and I am the Director of Development. And we also have on the call today Stephanie McCorkle and Rich Gehrman that are also a part of our team as well. If you have any questions today during the webinar or you're having any technical issues, please reach out to Stephanie and she would be happy to help. You can message her individually and then she can help you with any of those requests as well. She knows everything and she's amazing, so she will help you out. So we're going to get started today. I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping details before we get going. First off, I would love to make sure that you know that this is being recorded. And so you can find this later on our website. It'll be uploaded. And you can also reach out to us if you would like the recording as well. If you have any distractions today in the background, feel free to keep your camera off. If you'd like us to see you, feel free to turn your camera on. We're happy to see your face today. We have everybody muted at this time. We will have a time for question and answer at the end, at which point you're able to unmute yourself, ask the question when it is your turn, and then remute yourself for the question to be answered. If you have a question and you aren't comfortable taking your microphone off, go ahead and put the question in the chat box, which you can find by scrolling down to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see the option for the chat function there. That's where you can put questions, any comments, and we're happy to help to make sure that Anne, our speaker today, gets those read to her as well. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Rich Gehrman, our Executive Director, to get today's program started.
Thanks, Aviva, and welcome everybody again. Before I introduce our guest speaker, Ann Olson, I want to tell you a little bit about the upcoming webinar and one other initiative we have going. I'll make it brief, but the next webinar we have 2 weeks from now is with Catherine Piper, who is the leading expert on alternative response or family assessment, as it is known in Minnesota. She literally wrote the book on the research that's been done since 2013 on family assessment, and is going to talk about her findings. Her co-authors were some of the best known people in the field, so it's kind of an all-star kind of a research paper which talks about, among other things, a number of states that have backed away from family assessment programs because of too many child deaths, and about the lack of empirical evidence supporting it, and also about a more appropriate balance between a strength-based family-centered practice and child safety and well-being. So that's we were going to do an actual conference, a full conference with her last year, but it was timed out. So we invite you to do that. And also we are doing a series of communications with our legislators, and please watch for these for the next several weeks. These are messages that you can easily send to your own state representative and senator. You'll just have a link to click on and a message that has already been drafted for you, plus some room for any additional comments you might want to have. And that's supporting our legislation and closely related allies in the field. So it makes a big difference if you just click on that and take a minute or two to send a message to your legislator. So with that, let me introduce Ann Olson. She's the founder of Animal Folks, which is, like Safe Passage, an advocacy group that works on systemic change. In the case of Animal Folks, it's promoting humane treatment of animals through education, legislative action, and training authorities so they can identify and report abuse and enforce anti-cruelty laws. And I will just let her talk about her expertise and the research that's out there and some of the links between our work and her work. So Ann, please introduce yourself if you have any more things you want to say about yourself and your organization, and take it away.
Thank you very much. And you can hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yes, this is the presentation is animal cruelty, and it's really the link to human violence. And let's see if it's moving. Good. Who is Animal Folks? As Richard said, we are Minnesota-based. We're a nonprofit. We deal primarily with animal cruelty issues, excuse me, and system reform, so that laws are created or laws are enforced well in regards to the treatment of animals, which also can apply to humans. And my name is Ann Olson, founder and executive director. At the end, I'll give you my email and phone number. Just a warning up front, this is animal cruelty. So there will be some graphic content in regards to stories and some photos. Wanted to start with a quote by Phil Arco. He's the executive director of National Link Coalition, and they have been developing really for decades information about the link. But he sums it up well. When animals are abused, people are at risk. When people are abused, animals are at risk. And that's a core theme throughout this. Diving in, animal cruelty is a serious crime. Now we see it against crimes against animals, but these crimes can often also relate to humans and just the safety of a community. Just a bit of history. For all of you who are familiar with child abuse cases, you may be aware of the Mary Ellen Wilson case. She was born in 1864. She was severely abused by her foster parents, but it's really the first documented case of child abuse in the US. She was 10 years old at the time. But of interest was she was assisted then by Henry Berg, who is the head of ASPCA. I don't know if you've seen those commercials on TV, the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, because he, like many of us, believe you need to protect all vulnerable beings, children and animals. A little bit of Minnesota history too. The first animal protection law was actually passed before Minnesota was a state. And Minnesota's early protection agency was called the State Bureau of Child and Animal Protection. And that bureau recognized that both animals and children are vulnerable and needed to be protected. As far as Minnesota law, just a couple of things to highlight. The Minnesota Statutes, Chapter 343, it's called the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. That is the primary animal cruelty chapter in Minnesota. Also within that chapter, Section 21, there is a penalty that if the cruelty also relates to humans, to threaten a human, it's a higher penalty. Also, you may be familiar that under the domestic violence laws in Minnesota, the protection orders can also include pets. And child pornography laws. They too will do include sexual conduct with pets. There's quite a bit of documentation showing sexual animal abuse is tied closely to child animal abuse or child abuse. Okay, definition of animal. I just want to pull out one or two very key points of this law. In Minnesota, under Chapter 343, Section 20, animal means every living creature except members of the human race. The reason this is important is because some other states don't protect all animals. In Minnesota, we do. So that means pets or livestock or wildlife, every animal. Definition of animal cruelty. That's under Section 20, Subdivision 3. It means torture or cruelty. Means every act, omission, or neglect which causes or permits unnecessary or unjustifiable pain, suffering, or death. So as you'll see, it's not just an act, it could be omission of care, it could be neglect, but it's really causing pain, suffering, or death. Photograph at the right is a person got angry and killed his dog by hitting the dog with a 2x4. FBI. This has abuse and crimes against animals has really taken on more importance. Prior to 2016, the FBI didn't even record animal cruelty crimes, but they now understand the relationship and the link to human violence. So in 2016, they started creating and collecting data on animal cruelty. Now they have 4 different categories. One is animal neglect, simple and gross, like the photo on the right. Individual here in Minnesota, he decided he didn't want the dog anymore and didn't want to go out in the cold to feed him. So that was severe neglect. Gross neglect, by the way, can also be like hoarding, if ever any of you have seen hoarding cases with multiple animals. Intentional abuse and torture, that can be really the non-accidental. So it would be somebody who's beating or wounding the animal, poisoning the animal, all the intentional acts or torturing. Organized animal abuse is dog fighting or cockfighting. That's prevalent in Minnesota too. Tends to be tied to illegal gambling, illegal guns, illegal drugs. And then sexual animal abuse. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a few slides. So predictor and indicator. A lot of studies done on this. Harm to animals is a predictor crime of harm to people, towards people. And harm to animals is also an indicator crime of other violence going on in the home. So it's really red flag. It's good to be aware of it because it can start being a predictor and indicator of something else going on. And then the harm to animals does destabilize a community and contributes to overall lack of safety. So you may have heard articles about serial killers and those who kill or torture animals ahead of time. This does make it a public safety issue. Studies have shown that more than 50% of serial killers have a history of abusing animals. And a recent study, 2013, 43% of school shooters hurt or abused animals. It doesn't mean every serial killer or school shooter has or does harm animals, but that's still a strong percentage. But just as important or more is that animal cruelty is also linked to more common crimes, which is really what we're talking about. It's linked to child abuse, elder abuse, domestic violence. Just to give you, there are considerable studies, but just to cite a couple here, with domestic violence, between 49% and 86% of domestic violence survivors have reported that their pets have been threatened, hurt, or killed by their partners. Secondly, up to 56% of battered women delayed their escape out of fear for their animals, meaning they didn't want to leave the home for fear of their animals, or they couldn't find a shelter that would also take in their pet or livestock. This also happens to livestock, to farm situations. And then there's also been another study in 2012. Domestic violence batterers choose pets as targets because they believe police don't care about animal cruelty and they will get away with it. Now, actually, a lot of the police we work with do care and they take it seriously because they understand the link. There are some who sometimes don't enforce it fully because it may be a lower priority. Just a story, as mentioned, there are plenty of stories. This one, an advocate at a battered women's shelter told the story of a woman who finally left her abuser and was staying at the shelter. One day, the woman approached the advocate at the shelter. She came in very apologetic and said, "I have to go home." The victim had received pictures of her abuser chopping off the ears of her dog with gardening shears. The victim knew that the only way to save her dog and other animals at the house was to return to her abuser. Elder abuse. Again, other studies. This was actually by Randy Lockwood, who has done considerable studies on all this on the link. More than 35% of adult protection service caseworkers reported that their clients' pets were threatened, injured, killed, or denied care. More than 45% of a group surveyed of the caseworkers saw intentional animal abuse or neglect when visiting clients. And more than 75% of respondents noted that clients' concern for their pets' welfare affected decisions about interventions or additional services, such as maybe refusing to leave their home for fear of what will happen to their pet. Here are just a couple of issues with the elderly and the animals, and this was, you can find this on the National Link Coalition, again, great organization with a lot of different studies and data. Seniors may inadvertently neglect their animals due to fixed income or mobility issues, memory issues, or if they do have limited funds, they would self-neglect, you know, feed the dog or the cat first before themselves. Seniors may not receive full range of services because maybe the aides are reluctant to go into the home if there are dangerous pets or too many. Financial exploitation may occur by other family members holding the pet hostage to extort money. And then also another point, the death of a beloved pet may be especially painful for seniors if that's really their only connection that they have. Another story, elder abuse. A California humane investigator recalled responding to a call about several abandoned dogs left to starve in an empty apartment. After removing the animals, she heard whimpering from a closet. Expecting it to contain more dogs, she was horrified to find an emaciated old man who had also been left behind by his caretakers. Okay, child abuse. Again, many studies. I'm just pulling out a couple here. One of the first studies in 1983 showed that 88% of homes with physically abused children also included abuse or neglect of the family pet. Another study, up to 76% of animal cruelty occurs in front of children. And children who abuse animals are 2 to 3 times more likely to have been abused themselves. And another interesting point, inhabitants of physically abusive homes are 10 times more likely to be bitten by a family dog. You can have a home that can be very chaotic, a lot of activity. And dog bites are the 3rd leading cause of emergency room admissions in children. So that can just be another red flag. Wanted to mention this story because it's coming from an article which I'll cite later, written by Dr. Boat, who's a mental health professional, and Laura, who's social advocate, social services, social worker, and Allie Phillips, who's a prosecutor. They were talking about a boy they had all seen, Bobby, 9-year-old boy living with mother, father, and 2 siblings. He had revealed that animal cops had been to their house many times. Bobby had formed a special attachment to Smokey, their first cat. Smokey one day defecated outside the litter box, and Bobby's father threw Smokey across the room where the cat hit the wall. The father would not let anybody help Smokey. This is about power and control. So when Bobby's mother tried to help, the father hit her. Smokey died 2 days later. Bobby told Dr. Boat that if he loved something, his father would hurt it, which started impacting his behavior to other people as well as to other animals. His teacher reported that Bobby was both charming and angry in school. He was twice stopped for handling the school hamster roughly and had deliberately stepped on the gerbil in the 2nd grade classroom. So again, teachers too are able to see things that may be indicating problem at home. Now, long-term effects on well-being. You may have heard about Dr. Boat, licensed child psychologist. She has studied the toxic triad of animal abuse, child abuse, and domestic violence, and have found that abusive events, a toxic stress, which I'm sure many of you know better than I, in early childhood can harm developing brain architecture. It can create long-term hyper-responsiveness to perceived threats and lead to lifelong negative physical and mental health issues. Another point to consider within child abuse are really the juveniles, juvenile offenders. You've probably heard this quote by Margaret Mead. One of the most dangerous things that can happen to a child is to kill or torture an animal and get away with it. One study showed juvenile offenders account for at least 30% of all serious animal abuse cases reported in the media. And that means all the different interveners really need to identify and respond to early acts of cruelty. I'll talk a little bit more about reporting, but this is very big within the court system. We're just working on a chapter now for judges for the bench book so that they understand the link. And so if you or others are acting as witnesses, expert witnesses, that the judge will understand the importance of what may be happening to the child and issue orders for therapy or psychological help or other things to really address this issue. Public health issue, as well as public safety. The medical community now recognizes the significance of animal cruelty as an indicator of conduct disorder and other problems. In 1987, animal cruelty was added as a symptom of conduct disorder in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorder. It's under the category of aggression to people and animals. Another study done by Asione and Shapiro is when youth are harmful to animals, this is an indicator that other harmful acts may be occurring, such as setting fires or bullying or forced sex. So again, even looking at bullying may be a red flag for other behaviors. I mentioned I was going to just talk a little bit about animal sexual abuse too. Animal sexual abuse is an abusive act with an animal, and it can involve the rectum or anus or genitalia. It's really sexual contact with the animal and could be fondling or masturbation or penetration. A recent study was done where more than half of the offenders who had sexually abused animals had also sexually offended children and adults. And 11% of individuals convicted of having sex with animals had prior convictions for child pornography. 5% used the pornography to groom a child for sexual behavior. I wanted to mention this because we have been working, Jenny Edwards out of Washington State did these studies and we're working with her because unfortunately our bestiality law in Minnesota is only a misdemeanor. So we hope to amend that to make it stronger and especially do the protection with children within that. By the way, this is a goat, that's a leg of a goat. An individual had gone into a hobby farm, took the goat, tied up the goat, sodomized the goat, and the goat died. They actually found him and convicted him based on DNA. A story, this one by Allie Phillips, again, a prosecutor. She's written a great Bible on this called Understanding the Link Between Violence to Animals and People. Story, she said, I was contacted regarding an incident where a woman and her 3 sons were being abused by the husband. During one particularly violent incident, the abuser took one of the family dogs into the backyard and sexually assaulted the dog in front of his wife and children, and then shot and killed the dog. It was at that point that the wife realized that she and her 3 sons would likely be sexually assaulted and or killed if they did not leave immediately. She was able to get herself, her 3 sons, and the remaining dog to a shelter that was able to welcome pets on site. The husband was subsequently arrested and prosecuted for animal abuse. So even the animal abuse, it can be the foot in the door that can prevent future abuse of other beings, other individuals. This is why I think you had another presenter a number of weeks ago, where with animal abuse, sometimes even the neighbor can witness something and the neighbor can report it. It is often can be the first step to protecting not only the animals, but the people. Okay, a few Minnesota case examples, just to emphasize the fact that this happens in Minnesota. We have been doing and continue to do a study. We have over 1,500 animal cruelty cases in Minnesota for the past 10 years. And we're analyzing all the data now because a number of them are linked to abuse of people. With this case, the abuser, Anthony Gomez from St. Paul, had taken this is a young woman, his girlfriend at the time, took her dog there and severed the head of the dog. You may have seen this in the paper, and left it in a box on the grandmother's porch. The dog had been missing for 10 days and he didn't admit it was going on. So he was charged with animal cruelty. He was convicted of terrorist threats. But what's interesting about this is that if you look at all the cruelty cases before and after for this individual, there were acts of violence multiple times before. And even when he got out of prison for this act, he ended up stabbing a person. So it was definitely connected to violent acts. This one I wanted to include too, actually was convicted in 2016 in Carlton County. Domestic assault. He was threatening both the wife and the kids. The wife and the kids, to get away from him, ran into the basement. He took the firearm and shot through the floor. Luckily, they weren't harmed, but the animals were harmed. He then shot the pet snake, and then he took the other pets, the lizard, the turtle, the tarantula, and threw them outside in the cold where they died. He was convicted of terrorist threats as well as 2 counts animal cruelty. But I'm bringing this up just to show it's not just the cute puppy and kitten. It can be a lizard or a turtle or a tarantula or, again, livestock. It can be any kind of animal. It's power and control. It's using that other vulnerable being to get at the children or the spouse. Some other cases, again, there can be a long list. Hubbard County, person, domestic dispute, throws puppy, kills the puppy. Chippewa County, abused the child, then kicks dog in head, was convicted on domestic assault. Brown County, the cat defecated or was kicked for defecating in his shoe. Defendant threatens to break the leg of the child. Animal cruelty was dismissed and he was convicted on assault. Often these cases can be convicted on an assault just because they may have a higher penalty than animal cruelty. And I just wanted to mention this case too. This is a recent case in Minnesota, Washington County. This is Frodo. Earlier in the day, Frodo, an 8-year-old Bashan, was normal, playing normally. The owner, who's a 73-year-old woman, had left the home, and upon returning to her home, found Frodo on the kitchen floor, shaking and struggling for breath. Frodo was brought to the animal emergency center, where he was found to have been beaten repeatedly, so had blunt force trauma, and he was euthanized due to his severe injuries. And the abuser, he was a tenant in the home. She had rented out, this woman had rented out 2 rooms in her home. So he was charged and convicted of animal cruelty. What's interesting with this case is he pled guilty because the evidence was so strong against him due to the veterinarians knowing how to document it. But also of interest, I attended this hearing. We actually submitted a community impact statement on it, talking about the link. And the defendant, the young man's attorney, also told the judge that the abuser had been abused as a child. So the judge was using that to be able to give orders to get him therapy beyond supervised probation and other things to address his issues. So again, I've mentioned a little bit about power and control. That is one of the main reasons for this type of abuse. You may recognize this cycle, power and control circle. It's actually from a Duluth model for domestic violence. It's been adapted from the Domestic Violence Intervention Network. So just like with humans, animals, the abuser can use emotional abuse, like may make the pet disappear to take away the unconditional love of that animal, or can use the animal to force animal sexual abuse, or may refuse to allow the partner to spend money on pet food or pet care, or intimidation. You know, harm or kill the pet and say, next time it'll be you. Targeting pets. But also I have mentioned farm animals. There was a situation, there was one story, it was actually in Wisconsin, where a veterinarian went out to a farm. It was a dairy farm. and was amazed to see some of these cows because all their tails had been broken. Because the man, when angry, the farmer would go and twist the tails until they broke, and then would take a pipe and hit the cows' heads. And he would go back to his wife and say, next time it will be you. So she was very afraid of him as well as for the animals. Again, using children can harm or kill the pets to intimidate them, can be denying or blaming somebody else for the cruelty, legal abuse, threats, isolation. There can be multiple factors for power and control. I also found this was a very good study, again, by Assion and Thompson and Black. They really looked at multiple motivations for why a child would hurt an animal. And just to highlight just a couple of these, some might be curiosity or exploration where they just go too far. Some could be peer pressure. The peer is telling them to do it. Mood enhancement, relieve boredom, sexual gratification, forced abuse. Maybe they're coerced by a more powerful person. Attachment to the animal. Maybe the child kills the animal to prevent future torture by someone else. Identification with the child's abuser. They want to regain power, a sense of power by victimizing a more vulnerable animal. Imitation, maybe they're copying the abuser's discipline of an animal. Maybe they're rehearsing for abuse later, like being violent on stray animals or hurting the sibling's pet. It's an interesting study and really goes into it in more detail. Multiple reasons. So what can be done? All starts with awareness, which is why I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you about this. It's about being aware that both children and animals are vulnerable. They're not able to speak up for themselves against this abuse. Both can feel pain and suffer. And animal cruelty is often the warning sign of a chain of family violence. Basically, it starts with the family and also admitting, which I'm sure you've all already know, that the family has changed. In fact, family we see has multiple species. It's not just human-centered. In fact, in Minnesota, about 70% of families have a pet. 99% of pet owners consider their animals as members of the family. 2/3 of home with children under age 6 have pets. 3/4 of home with children over age 6 have pets. A couple of other studies here too. 80% of children's dreams are about animals. 80 to 90% of children's first experience with death is the loss of a pet. So the role of that pet in the life of the children and the life of the family is considerable. And these animals provide comfort. We've been working on a piece of legislation now about companion animals for companion animals. And we've been collecting stories from people during COVID and what their animal has meant to them. And we've got over, I think, close to 70 stories now. And here's two. From trauma therapy to job loss and even a breakup, my kitten named Cauliflower has been there for me through some of my toughest times. Since becoming empty nesters, our dogs have provided us company. But this pandemic level took it to a new level. Who knew they would now be our entire social life? Our pets are family, and they deserve all the love and safety that comes with being part of a family. So a couple of things going back to what can be done. What number of different experts have suggested is just start with some basic questions, being aware of it now. If you can, incorporate basic questions in your interviewing. So ask children about their pets. It's been learned that children may be more willing to open up about what's going on with them if you first start with their pet. And these answers may reveal incidents about violence. For instance, in one story, the mental health professional was just talking to the child, knew nothing about any violence from the stepdad. But he said, after my stepdad beats me up, my dog jumps up and licks my tears. So that indicated other violence in the home. So 3 basic questions are just, do you have pets at home? How are they cared for? Are you worried about their welfare? 2, use available tools. There are tools out there if you need ideas just to jumpstart some conversations with yourself or your department, your agency, your supervisor. National Link Coalition actually lists some of these, like Anna Care and Anna Child. That's actually, it's a 124-page handbook with suggestions for assessing and treating children who have been abused, witnessed animal cruelty, or actually abused animals themselves. There are other different studies. Some are more studies, some are questionnaires, some have different techniques you can use. If you want some of these, you can certainly contact me as well. I wanted to pull out one. This was an article that I mentioned earlier. Collaborating to assess, intervene, and prosecute animal abuse, a continuum of protection for children and animals. Barbara Boat, Lynn Lohr, Ellie McPhillips. Again, Dr. Boat is mental health, Lynn Lohr is social worker, Ellie Phillips is prosecutor. So they each came up with different tactical tools. One is called the Childhood Trust Survey on Animal-Related Experiences. And she developed 10 screening questions. This to the right is just, it's in the appendix. To the right are just 3 questions. She said, don't have them fill it out. It's more oral for an interview. Like, have you or your family ever had a pet? Do you have a pet or pets now? Did you ever have a favorite pet? So it's really just to get the different people talking. There's also in the appendix a family-based risk assessment, which was developed by the social worker, and it really has 6 common behaviors. And it's got a chart in there, which is really looking at every person in the family, which includes the animal, about noisiness, messiness, disobedience, eating difficulties, toileting difficulties, level of activity. Because what they were finding too is just like the noisiness, a dog barking constantly can maybe trigger anger in somebody in the household. It could be similar to a baby constantly crying. So there can be similarities. So don't forget the animal, because that could also be a trigger. And then the third is, oh wait, I did want to mention something about that too. In talking to Phil Arco with the Link Coalition, he said he encourages social workers too, who go into, or mental health professional, or whoever go on site into a home. Sometimes he has found that the caseworker will say, okay, put all the animals in the back room, shut the door. He said, and prefers, in talking with other social workers, to be able to see the animals and how they interact with the family members, because that's normal, what he's seen, rather than having them hid away. That may not always be easy, but it is a suggestion. The third bullet is a prosecutor's checklist of abuse or conduct toward animals. That's really for prosecutors, of things to look for. Okay, a third aspect of what you could do. If you see this, report what you suspect. And that means if you suspect animal cruelty is going on, that could again give you the foot in the door. It could also mean somebody could be taken away if they are convicted. You report it. Animal cruelty is a crime, so it's reported to local sheriff office or your local police department. Obviously, if something immediate is happening, call 911. Under Minnesota law, that chapter I mentioned before, chapter 343, Minnesota also allows you to report it to the Animal Humane Society, or any humane society that would have the humane agents. They do. They have 3 humane agents. Minnesota Federated Humane Societies as well. They have humane agents. They would help investigate, but then they work collaboratively with sheriff office or police department. You can also report it to local animal control services. Minneapolis is excellent in what they do, and St. Paul. Some animal control services may not be trained in animal cruelty, so it really may vary. Now this last bullet, this isn't for reporting animal cruelty. This is Minnesota Day One, and you may already be familiar with this crisis hotline. It's really for domestic abuse, but they have a pet and people program. So if you call them, they will help the person who is being hurt through domestic violence find a facility that also will take pets. And in Minnesota, some shelters do, people shelters do. Some animal shelters will also hold the animal and care for the animal. They don't advertise it because they don't want abusers to know. Reporting animal cruelty, this is what we actually created. We have a manual for veterinarians, so we train veterinarians because, you know, just like teachers of children, veterinarians are physicians of children. Veterinarians will see animals. So, and they are mandated reporters. So we've been teaching them for the last 6 years what to look for, how to report it. Perhaps in the discussion we can talk about this. Is a manual for your disciplines and your profession needed? So you know what to look for, who to report to. And in fact, that brings up a point that Rich has mentioned too, that we've discussed with him and he's discussed with us about cross-reporting and cross-training. In 1985, the US Surgeon General emphasized that traditional approaches to violence in America really was an unmitigated failure. He was suggesting interdisciplinary approach, which is really about cross-reporting between disciplines. But in Minnesota, we do not have any law like that. You know, veterinarians do not report child abuse, or social workers are not mandated to report animal abuse. This really varies state to state. We do have a list of what states do report it. I believe like CPS, DHS, and social workers are mandated to report animal abuse in Connecticut, DC, Illinois, Louisiana, Nebraska, Tennessee, and West Virginia. But proceeding with something like this, it would need legislation, but it would also need training. So anybody who does it would need what to do. Maybe right now you can develop interagency MOUs that could be helpful. Additional resources, you can go to our website, and we have some of these resources posted on that. We'll continue to add more. National Link Coalition I mentioned. Cornerstone is the one who has the Day One crisis. Red Rover has domestic violence and pets. There's a safety program. So I wanted to wrap this up with a quote from Dr. Boat, which seemed appropriate. Enhancing our awareness and knowledge about the relationship between violence to animals and violence to children provides a unique opportunity to enhance our services to both. So I understand now, looking at the time, that we shift into a Q&A or discussion. My hope is I'd like to hear actually as much as possible from all of you, or please contact me at this email or phone number. We want to learn more about your professions and what stories do you share? What have you seen? And specifically, what barriers do you think you'd face to making these changes, to talking about pets with clients, and what resources do you need? So that's it. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Ann. And I'm going to open up the questions. If you look, Ann, in your chat box, there are a couple that have already come in. Maybe we can start by you responding to those ones, if you could. Can you see them okay?
I can't see any of them. Should I do the stop share and get out of it?
I can stop sharing. Don't worry about that. But you don't have, there's a couple questions in your chat box, if you could see that. One is, any animal abuse, were there any animal abuse cases where perpetrators were treated and changed their behavior? And the same person said, do you see animal cruelty often as a multi-generational problem, similar to child abuse? So is there treatment? Do people get treatment for this? And the multi-generational problem?
Regarding the treatment, some of the lists that I showed you, like ANACARE or the questionnaire, from what I have learned, none of these have been assessed. So unfortunately, what if they have been implemented, there's no assessment, like if the court orders an individual to be able to do ANACARE. There hasn't been an assessment of it yet to be able to see if it works. Also, the one thing about a lot of this is it's still in its infancy. So just getting judges to know about these kind of programs and how to do it, a lot of them don't know they exist. So it's still in the infancy to be able to get the treatment, and then let alone to be able to see if it works, unfortunately. And multi-generational, unfortunately, I don't have any knowledge of that or studies of that.
Well, I want to invite other people to jump in, and if you want, you can, turn on your video, but just make a couple of points and a couple of comments about your presentation. And we did have a presentation some months ago by Andrew Campbell, whom Ann knows, who has introduced us to the whole concept, really, of family violence, that domestic abuse and animal abuse and child abuse often go together. And the thing that I found most interesting about that was, and Ann alluded to this, is that often animal abuse can give you about a 1-year advance warning of child and domestic abuse, because neighbors will report animal abuse. I mean, this is one reason. Neighbors will report animal abuse, whereas generally the woman self-reports domestic abuse. And for many of the reasons that Ann touched on, will take their time doing that and try to find other ways to resolve the problem. So you can maybe get an early indication of abuse of children by cross-reporting or having communications between the child protection and the animal protection people. So Ann and I have talked about, with several other people, potentially proposing some legislation next year that would require cross-reporting among those entities. So I did want to mention that to you, and stay tuned. Are there other questions or things that people would like to explore here?
Hi, Ann. This is Stephanie McCorkle, one of the staff people here at Safe Passage. And I was just wondering if you had heard of or have any experience working with the Purple Leash Project that's headed up by Purina Dog Food. I've started to become more aware of and informed of their work, trying to increase the number of domestic violence shelters that will also allow folks to bring their pets with them. And so they're trying to increase that around the country. So I didn't know if you were, if you had any inside information, or like, what's your opinion of the Purple Leash Project?
I don't know the Purple Leash Project specifically. However, I know the federal government, was it about 2 years ago, recently passed a law that gave more money for shelters, human shelters, to be able to also bring in animals, because they did recognize that this was a huge problem. If women weren't leaving the household and it was an abusive household because they were staying to protect the pets. So they were giving that out as grants, and I know a number of different organizations throughout the United States were applying for it. So maybe the Purple Leash became part of that.
Yeah, that could be, you know, and I'd come across the Purple Leash Project, actually an ad for it in a Real Simple magazine. And I was reading it one day, and you know, it was interesting that I, you know, came across that there, because you know, it was just kind of like I was reading a magazine at the swimming pool, you know, and I turned and I saw this ad for the Purple Leash Project, and I read about it, and you know, was very interested in their work, and immediately started to do research into it and see, you know, what that was all about. So it seems like a really, really wonderful project.
And I think
there's also, I was just going to mention, and I put this in the presentation, Red Rover really has a high reputation. And they've been they and others have been getting more and more involved during COVID, you know, because you need pet food and you need, you know, pet friendly housing, you need all of that. So.
And I think, Stephanie, since you bring it up, I think one of the main things I also got out of that Andrew Campbell presentation was that the uptake from domestic violence shelters on that kind of revenue and on the whole idea of being pet friendly is very low. And since if women primarily don't go to shelters because of fear for their animals, there's also the issue that they take their children with them, and a primary emotional support for the child is the pet. And so it seems like it's should be #1 priority almost for domestic violence shelters to be able to receive pets for a variety of reasons. And also I mentioned there's a whole field of study I was unaware of what happens with natural disasters, what kind of things happen. And people will refuse to leave their homes as the flood waters are rising up, you know, through the living room, because they can't take their pets to the shelter. So people will literally sacrifice their lives for their pets. And we just need to recognize how important a factor that is, especially since a huge number of families now have pets. I think you said 75% or something like that.
Yeah, about 70%. It's huge. And you hit on a very big point, which is often these animals are just the support system for the child. And it's what they turn to for an unconditional love. And when that animal is being used as a pawn to instill fear, but then if they have to separate from the animal when they're taken out too, you know, so discussions to be able to have the child still having that animal can really help. And you're talking about disasters too. Yeah, I actually got started with all of this because of Hurricane Katrina, because I went down and people weren't leaving homes. They were willing to die because they weren't allowed to take their pet with.
Yeah, I saw a lot of that. I lived down in Atlanta when Hurricane Katrina and Rita came through, and we had a lot of families coming to Atlanta who were displaced from the storms, and there were a lot of reports of like having to have left their pets behind and how traumatic that was. We had a lot of students that came to that I was suddenly teaching at the middle school I was teaching at, who were coming into our classes and were very distraught about having to leave their pets behind, and they didn't know where their pets were. So that was a real emotional, real heavy toll for them, especially for those children.
Oh yeah. Well, and that's where now with COVID, we're seeing like some of the stories we get, people wouldn't get out of bed except they have to feed their dog or feed their cat. You know, again, it provides a support system. But at some point too, I would love to talk about the barriers or what people, you know, really see as barriers for implementing some questions. You know, do you have a pet in interviews, or
you mean as part of their protocol for doing their work? If
it's easy to do so, or if they'd find resistance.
And also as pediatricians, to bake that into their protocols, which are supported by electronic health record systems now. So technically it'd be relatively easy to do. And I just wanted to touch on one other point too, and that came up as well with the Andrew Campbell presentation, which is that, and in our conversations, is that often, you know, programs that deal with intimate partner violence or domestic violence are reluctant to engage in cross-reporting arrangements with child protection and animal abuse professionals, because they want the woman to have control of when she reports and discloses her situation, and not kind of have somebody blow her cover, so to speak, by reporting something that angers the abuser. So that just speaks to the complexity of trying to work out how you would actually take advantage of the information that you learn about family violence from an incidence of animal abuse, and be able to actually, operationalize that so that you provide protection to the child in a way that doesn't cause, other damage that you didn't intend it. So it's not a simple thing to think about this coalition and cross-reporting among these different kinds of entities, but we're in a conversation about that, and hopefully it'll lead to some thoughtful legislation in the next year or two.
Yeah, it's always good to ask a lot of questions and learn and listen. What are people hearing and thinking? But I do believe the animal cruelty, we see a lot of it, and we're talking to law enforcement and prosecutors and judges too. And if it can be reported, it can be, as you suggested too, the first foot in the door to stop other violence from happening.
And to reach children much sooner. I think that's
very much.
Well, we're winding up now. If there's any additional questions, I want to invite you to jump in, and also to just say the National Link Coalition is where a lot of this research resides, and Anne referred to it. So if you want to look at this crossover kind of research, that's where to start. So any other questions or comments that people have, or things you want to contribute while we're all here? Well, with that, Anne, I want to thank you for putting together, this presentation. I know it wasn't the best time of year for you, and it was time consuming. So we all appreciate your effort on this.
I love the opportunity. Thank you.
And maybe we'll be working together over the next couple of years on some of these issues. We hope so.
Hope so. Thank you, everybody.